What's unique about student housing is your customer doesn't have a job. So when prices begin to increase for that set of customers, it's
Mm,
more impactful and it creates a broader problem. What has resulted is that many developers aren't willing to go into smaller tertiary markets to develop for a customer that doesn't have a job, right? And
yep.
so that's the problem that has to be fixed.
Quick favor before we jump in. It always surprised me that a large percentage of people who listen to this show regularly haven't yet subscribed. If you're a commercial real estate operator, investor, or builder who values conversations like this around deals, capital, and technology, please take 2 seconds and hit subscribe. It's a simple, free way to support the show. My commitment to you is that my team and I will continue bringing you higher level operators, stronger conversations, and real execution level insights every single week. Thank you. I truly appreciate it. Welcome back to the AI Edge podcast, where we sit down with operators, investors, and builders who are making real decisions in commercial real estate and thinking clearly about systems, execution, and long-term leverage. Today, we're talking about student housing, impact-driven development, and what it looks like to build a platform that solves real problems while still operating with discipline. My guest today is Charles Williams, CEO and president of Pioneer Realty Capital. Charles and his team acquired and developed student housing, and they also operate with purpose-driven component through their nonprofit initiative, Project PRC. Charles, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here, Lewis.
Excellent. Great to have you here, Charles. Charles, I want to start off with your path. When someone asks you today, what do you do? How do you describe that in plain English?
I try to explain it in terms, well, I simply say I'm in real estate. And so now, of course, real estate has multiple facets to it. And so it really depends on how inquisitive the person is. If I'll kind of delve into what we actually do. But you know, our entire company is a service-driven, purpose-driven organization that looks for opportunities to add good. One of the things that we frequently say, our goal is to leave it better than we found it. And so we have a lot of structure, a lot of processes, but our end goal is to improve the communities that we serve and also to have a lasting impact with what we do as a company.
That's beautiful. What was the moment that you realized real estate was the lane that you wanted to drive in?
Well, I'm going to answer that question honestly. So, when I got out of grad school, I started doing financial consulting, helping small businesses structure their financial records properly so that they would gain access to capital. And in the process of doing that, I was introduced to the commercial real estate industry, and I was invited to represent an insurance company in selling their loans, basically. And at the time, that was called a correspondent lender. And that's when the insurance company would pay me or pay my company to go out and originate loans for them. So we did our first transaction, Mississippi Garden Apartments in New Albany, Mississippi. And when that transaction closed, took about 3 weeks to originate, get everything done, and get it closed. It actually closed very quickly, which is that was an anomaly in itself, but took about 3 weeks to close. But when I received that wire for $48,000, and I realized that all of that money was mine, I didn't have to share it with anyone, and I earned it. I said, well, you know what? I think I'm going to change careers. We're on a new path. We're going to focus on real estate. Before we were doing general consulting, helping clients raise equity and debt. And these were small businesses. So these were not big deals. These was very small, very labor intensive. But when I started closing commercial real estate deals and earning 40, 50, 100, $200,000 per transaction, then that changed the trajectory of my career in life.
That's fantastic. What did your early years teach you about risk, people, and capital that you still rely on today?
Well, I think, risk is there's always a risk reward component in what you do. Most people are fairly risk adverse because they don't have that confidence in themselves, or perhaps they don't have, that structure, or that network of family, friends, advisors that encourage them in their path. And so that fuels that risk aversion. And I'll give you an example. Most entrepreneurs, when you're excited about an idea, when you're got a group that just showed up, when you're excited about an idea, and you share it with your friends and your family, and it's something that nobody else has ever done, there's always going to be someone that's going to speak negatively of that. And that's going to cause you to rethink your idea, even though it may be a great idea, but it's gonna increase your risk level. Say, well, this is risky. Maybe I shouldn't do it. And people start second guessing themselves, and then as a result, they never actually execute or carry out their plan. And I think that I've always been different in anything that I've done because I tend to be very competitive by nature. Um, and I'm also, you know, an indefinite student. I'm always learning and studying. And so as a result of that, I had the self confidence that when I decided I was going to do something, I would go and do it. And then if there was any negativity surrounding me, I would shut that negativity out and I would go out and work hard. And fortunately, I've had my failures,
Mhm.
but I've had more successes than I've had failures.
That's beautiful. So you chose one word of your journey as progressive. Why that word?
Well, because it is a progression of my career. If you think I started out in the technical field, which is very interesting. And then, now ended up in the finance field, and then from finance into commercial mortgages and then into owning commercial real estate and now structuring very complicated bond transactions. So there's a progression there. And what happens is, as you go along that path, you assemble bodies of knowledge, and you're able to bring those bodies of knowledge, together, and that allows you to progress to another level. And so that's really the basis of that word for me, progressive.
What specific season or turning point where progressive became your framework?
When I had kids,
Okay.
and I looked at my children and I looked at my wife, and I realized that it was my responsibility to provide for them and to make sure that they didn't have to worry about, a place to live or having food in the refrigerator. One of the experiences I had in corporate America is I couldn't keep a job. I worked for well, I guess I shouldn't call it the name of the company. I worked for my first technical company for 7 years, and I was making them a bunch of money, but, they fired me, and when I shut down my engineering company, went back into corporate America, I was running a group that had been doing about $3 million for the last 5 years. The first year I was there, I increased the revenue to $14 million, and they fired me. And so, I realized that, it didn't make sense for me to use my abilities and my talents and my skills to enrich others and then at the same time be at their mercy. And so, I made the decision that that was not going to happen again. If I got fired again, it was going to be because I fired myself. And so that's what really allowed me to, bet hard on myself and then to put myself in a position where I could experience the success I created through my hard work.
Beautiful. Where does progression show up in leadership and decision making, or how do you treat your partners and your investors?
Yeah, so that's very important to us. Again, our goal is leave it better than what we found it. And we've been entrusted, I've been entrusted with a lot of gifts in terms of my employees. I consider them to be gifts and men and women, and have proven to be gifts for me because they've entrusted their careers to me. And so they've allowed me to be in a position to lead and guide them and to, organize them along with the other assets owned by our company to create results and create success. And then, of course, we have our investors, and they've done the same things. If you consider that many of the investors we work with are retirees or they're nearing retirement, and they've worked their entire lives to create the little wealth that they have. And then they take that wealth and they entrust it with me and my organization. And so that certainly makes us very aware and conscious of the trust that's been put in our company and me as the leader of this organization. And we work hard to make sure that we're good stewards of those investor dollars. And of course, as a leader, the talent that we have in our organization, I work hard to make sure that I'm a good steward of that talent as well.
That's beautiful. You've been outspoken about student housing as a worthy cause. From your vantage point, what is the actual problem or what's broken or what's undersupplied? And what do most people not understand?
Well, I mean, we have economic cycles, and if you look at the economic cycle since 2000, let's just go back to 2001. And that's when we had the terrorism season where and so when those things happen, it disrupts the economy. Debt's pulled out of the market, equity is pulled out of the market, and then you have a number of years where banks aren't lending. Okay. Now, if you take 2001 and you go back 18 years prior to that, people were having babies. Okay. And so now 18 years later, you get to 2001 and you're not replenishing the supply of housing available for those babies that are now becoming adults. They're going to need a place to live.
Mm,
Okay. And we've had many disruptions in our economy since 2001. We had the CMBS, the commercial mortgage or mortgage-backed securities crisis. There just been a number of things that have occurred. And during those times, it takes capital out of the market for real estate development, in particularly niche markets like student housing. So they were not building housing in general during those economic disruptions. They certainly were not building student housing during those disruptions. So what happens is your supply begins to shrink. Okay. And as your supply shrinks, guess what happens with demand? It goes up. Now, you asked about, so what's the problem? The problem is going back to supply and demand. When supply becomes scarce, and demand starts to increase, what happens? How does that impact pricing? It's going to drive the price up because you have scarcity in your supply. Now, many markets can absorb the price increases associated with their markets. People, for instance, their primary residences, you still see people buying homes in those markets.
mhm.
But what's unique about student housing is your customer doesn't have a job. So when prices begin to increase for that set of customers, it's
Mm.
more impactful and it creates a broader problem. And what has resulted is that many developers aren't willing to go into smaller tertiary markets to develop for a customer that doesn't have a job, right? And so that's the problem that has to be fixed. And that was the premise behind our looking for a way to address that issue and working with universities, working with the tax exempt municipal bond market and creating these public-private partnerships that will allow us to gain access to inexpensive capital that will allow us to provide housing in these tertiary markets for that customer set that's not yet working.
What happens to students and campuses when housing falls short?
Well, you literally, that's a very good question. And that's a really public question for people that are looking, they can see it publicly. But we have a significant housing crisis in general, especially in tertiary markets and at these universities where you're dealing with, you know, historically Black colleges and universities or majority Hispanic universities and populations. These folks, first of all, they don't have quality housing if they have housing at all. And what's resulted is the significant housing insecurity to the point that you even have students that are sleeping in their cars. Yeah. And it's a problem that has to be fixed. And the broader impact of not addressing the student housing issue has to do with the impact it's going to eventually have on our economy. If we don't have productive citizens in our country, then we're going to have to import those productive citizens into the country, right? Well, if you look at our current immigration policy, we've decided that that's not a good idea anymore, which, I try to be apolitical, not involved, but the real impact is noticeable. You have to have talent in order to have a productive economy, a productive society, right? And so now, so where are you going to get that talent? You have to educate them. It's interesting right now, we are in an industrial revolution. Okay, we hear words like, well, AI, blockchain, all this new technology that 10, 15 years ago, these were concepts. But now this is our new reality. And it's the type of industries that we're creating that you can't just roll out of bed with a high school diploma and go get a job in these industries. This talent has to be trained and has to be educated. And if these students have to be trained and educated, they're going to need a place to live. And so you can see how all that comes together with this student housing situation.
Amazing. Walk me through your model at a high level. How do you decide what to acquire or develop, and what has to be true for a deal to make sense?
Yeah. So, it's basic real estate economics, supply and demand, and being able to have access to capital. And so supply and demand is easy. You can go in and measure that very easily. Having the access to the capital that's needed to fully execute on that plan, that's where the challenge is for most people and even for us, quite frankly. So one of the things that we do of course, we do a market study. We determine if there's enough, if students are able to pay enough to pay the rent. We got to make sure the rent is paid. And then are the universities willing to participate? You know, what's really interesting, some universities we deal with, they're eager to participate. But you got to understand that most universities are run by educators,
Mm,
not business people.
correct.
Okay. Now, an educator, and we need educators and we need people running you know, universities or at least involved in universities that understand education. But the university is a business. And so therefore you have to be willing and able to make a business decision that benefits your university, right? And so sometimes that's a challenge with folks that lead universities. When we go in with an economic model and we talk about driving the cost of capital down so that we can afford to provide student housing for their students, and then even supplement the cost of that student housing through our charitable programs for a non-business person, that seems like gibberish,
Yeah, they don't
right?
understand it.
So I would say that's probably our biggest challenge. Your question was, so what determines if we're going to go into a market and serve that university? A lot of it is based on the relationship that we can establish with the university. There are some significant policy, assets in place in the United States that give universities access to low cost capital, and to even acquire student housing at virtually no cost out of their pocket. But if you don't understand how that business works, then as an educator who's a non-business person, it's going to sound like, well, this is too good to be true, and somehow they're trying to scam us,
Mm,
particularly in certain communities that are very sensitive to business structures that they have very little familiarity with. Everything's going to seem like, yeah, that's too good to be true. It doesn't work. Now a smart person would go and ask the right questions, and then go do the research and figure out if this is legitimate or not. That's what a smart person would do, you know. And many of our educators are very smart and they do that. But you look at areas where they're suffering with student housing. Just imagine the U.S. government have put policies in place to make sure that universities can enter into public-private partnerships to provide student housing for those universities, and yet that university doesn't have student housing. What does it tell you is the problem?
They're not educated.
Yeah. And so our a lot of what we do is we spend a lot of time working with the leaders of these universities. But you got to understand that, you know, there's a lot to manage in a university. You got, you know, you're managing your own little city. You know, just imagine a city of 18-year-olds, 18 and 19 and 20-year-olds. You're dealing with some issues.
That sounds
Okay. You know, and then you have your professors and you're trying to get research dollars in. It's just so much that a president of a university has to deal with. And then the staff that that president has to rely on to help them make decisions, where they're all educators, you know, and don't have a lot of business experience. And so generally if you worked 20 years and you've gotten promoted to a CFO position at a university, and somebody comes to you with an idea that nobody in your university has ever heard of before, what are you automatically going to say to that idea? I'm not putting my 20-year career on the line for that.
no way.
Yeah. So as I mentioned, we spend a lot of time, you know, educating. Now it is getting a little bit easier because the demand for student housing is so high that these administrators are being forced to listen, you know, because, you know, in some cases we may be the only solution in town, you know, and so as a result, now we don't, you know, as we talked about our mission, we have our charitable mission, then we have our, you know, our standards. We don't go in and look to take advantage of schools or universities or anyone for that matter, because you can do good and do well. That's something we truly believe. And so even in areas where we can go in and, you know, maybe do better, we don't. You know, we want everything we do when it's investigated or evaluated to prove to be impeachable.
That's honorable. What's the biggest underwriting mistakes that you see others make in student housing, Charles?
Well, I mean, the math is fairly simple, believe it or not, in real estate in general, once you understand it. And it's more of a matter of understanding the terminology than really understanding the math. But, you know, one of the biggest mistake, and we've even made this mistake before, and we've learned from it, and we've had to create some guardrails to protect ourselves from it, is understanding that the dynamic of your customer, and that's the student. Now, I'm gonna tell you something that might surprise you. Did you know that if a parent gave money to that student to pay his rent and pay it on time, did you know that a lot of students will take that money and not pay their rent?
Can you imagine that?
Can you imagine that? You know, you're dealing with, you know, and I was there too. I can remember being 19 years old and I received a Pell Grant. I think I got $8,500 in my Pell Grant. The first time in my life I had ever had over $500 in my pocket. And then now I'm walking around, I got $8,500 in my pocket, right?
Hmm.
Do you think all $8,500 went to cover my educational experience expenses?
Today it should have, but it didn't then.
Well, some of it got wasted, right? You know, some of the money was used for things it was not intended for. And so now your question had to do what's the underwriting mistake? And that is understanding that just because someone signed a lease, that lease has been guaranteed by the parent, doesn't mean that they're actually going to pay the rent,
Mm.
especially if the customer is an 18-year-old or 19-year-old. Now, some are responsible. many are not. And what we've have had to do, that's the reason for the programs through our nonprofit organization, our rental assistance, our eviction avoidance program, our financial literacy programs, our rent subsidy programs. That was the whole premise behind putting those structures in our nonprofit organization so that we could have that financial and educational support for those student housing communities that we own and serve.
That sounds like a tough deal for an investor to invest into.
Yeah, yeah.
How do you think about demand drivers, enrollment, campus growth, affordability, and competitive supply?
Well, as we talked about, we are definitely in an industrial revolution. And if you don't see it, and if you're not participating, you're going to be left behind. Jobs, everything is being automated to one degree or another. The things that we do in terms of when we're underwriting and analyzing a deal or researching a deal or evaluating an opportunity, there's probably an AI tool that we're using in every bit of that. I went to a conference last year that talked about AI technology and how it's impacting, uh, real estate in general. And the things that are coming to market are just absolutely amazing. But here's the thing: in order to use these tools, you got to have an education. Someone is going to have to train you, right? And so that's the biggest thing that we see is coming.
Amazing. Where do you see deals going sideways, Charles, most often? And how do you de risk those points?
Yeah, and see, that's where, with regards to building student housing with the most risky customer set in the most risky environment. That's why you see the larger developers not going into tertiary markets or not providing housing at certain universities or a certain demographic because it is fraught with risk. There's significant amount of risk. And the deal will never pencil and it will never make sense. Then when you add to that, the inflation of labor costs, inflation with regards to material costs, those deals, there's no way those deals can pencil. So how do you fix that problem? Well, these are problems that affect the public, right? So there has to be some in public involvement to help address those issues or de-risk that deal to make it make sense. And that's why we created our nonprofit organization for the very purpose of providing support for the student and also for providing support for the those equity investors or debt investors that are going into these markets. We got to provide housing, but how do you protect, the interests of the folks that are providing the debt? How do you protect the interests of the folks that are investing the equity? Well, there has to be a public component through our nonprofit organization that's going to provide that layer of support for the student and for the investors that are invested in that deal.
Wow, that's amazing. Charles, a lot of people talk about public private partnerships. Very few execute well. In your world, what makes a public private partnership actually work?
Yeah, you first of all, your interests have to be aligned. And I'll give you an example. And this is, you know, unfortunately is more often the case than not the case. We met with a university, notable university, here in Texas, and they had entered into a public-private partnership with a large real estate development company. The university signed a long-term master lease. And if that university has an investment grade credit rating, that lease is basically becomes currency. You can use the value of that lease to go to the bond market and basically get 100% financing to develop the property. Now, the university's mission was very clear. They needed housing and they were willing to put their credit on the line to secure that housing. Now, that's what their interest was.
Mhm.
Okay. Now, the developer's interest was solely to make a profit. So it didn't matter to that developer, the quality of the product that they were providing. They were more profit driven than solution driven. So their interests were not aligned. So at this particular university, it happened to be in a coastal town. So you got the sea, you got land, and you got the sea.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
And in this sea, there happens occasionally to be hurricanes.
Yeah. Especially if
Okay.
we're calling the Gulf. Are we talking about the
Yeah.
Gulf?
We're talking about the Gulf. And I'm trying not to give the university away because I don't want to embarrass them. But this is the real deal. Okay. So the developer comes in, they build this beautiful building. It looked gorgeous, right?
Mhm.
But that structure was not hurricane proof.
Boy.
And it wasn't hurricane proof because, it costs more money to build a hurricane proof building in that area. So
Wow.
remember, his interest, the developer's interest was profit driven.
Yep.
Okay. University, hey, I need a place for my students to live.
Mhm.
So the moment they completed that student housing property, before anyone could move into the building,
No.
guess what happened?
Katrina?
A hurricane. And do you know that building has never been occupied? Now, the university was on the hook for a 30-year lease contract for that building.
Wow.
Okay. And it had to unwind that contract by writing a very large check to get out of that public private partnership. So there's taxpayer money that's just simply gone to waste. And to this date, that building sits there and it's
That's terrible.
now the problem that created. So now when Charles Williams comes to that university and says, "Hey, we want to do a public-private partnership," I had to run out with protection, hoping I didn't get shot. Right? You see, and so that's why universities are reluctant to enter into it. And it isn't that the public-private partnership is bad, but you certainly have to make sure you're doing the deal with the right people and the people whose interests are aligned. Now, one of the things with regards to our organization is that public private partnership is established with our nonprofit organization. Okay. Now, that automatically aligns the interests of the university with the developer automatically because guess what? Our nonprofit can't make a profit. They're
It's
not profit driven.
right.
Okay. So again, it's an alignment of interest. If you're going to do a public-private partnership, you have to make sure if it's a partnership, your interests are aligned. Okay. And if you're a technically a nonprofit institution like a university, and you're doing a partnership with a for-profit, that automatically takes your interest out of alignment. Okay. And so we intentionally created our structure for the benefit of the universities. And we take now, these properties, they have to debt service. In other words, the property has to generate more money than the cost of the debt, right?
Mhm.
So by design, there is a profit component to every one of these developments. But what we do is we take a portion of that, what we would call profit or excess revenue, and we
Mhm.
use it to fund a subsidy pool, and we allow the university to control the subsidy pool, and they are able to deploy that to help students that are perhaps first generation students, at risk students, scholarship students, however they see fit to use that subsidy pool. Because again, the goal of the nonprofit is not profit, but it's to provide a service to the community.
Beautiful. What does the timeline really look like, and what are the common friction points?
The timeline with regards to what development or
Development.
yeah, so real estate is real estate, and I will tell you there's no perfect real estate deal. There's no perfect construction deal. It's amazing things that even get built these days because generally, anything that can go wrong can sometimes go wrong, and you just have to deal with that. There's always construction risk. Now, there are things that we do to mitigate that risk. There's financial risk, there's development risk, there's partner risk, bad actor risk. but what we try to do is, and our partners, because remember that the nonprofit is accessing the tax exempt municipal bond market. And so there are multiple fiduciaries in place to protect that capital.
Okay.
And so there are a lot of structures. The general contractor has to be bondable, and they have to be able to provide a payment and performance bond. Well, our projects are $100 million plus. Okay, if you're a general contractor and you can afford to get that type of insurance on your company, where you can bond $100 million payment and performance bond, then you're a pretty good group, and you have a track record of success because the insurance company is not going to give you that type of bond. So that's a protection. But we do guaranteed max contracts. In addition to the, general contractor, we have construction manager at risk that's managing the general contractors. So there are multiple layers there to make sure that, the end product gets delivered and that we're able to fulfill our responsibility to make sure that those student housing units are delivered on time.
Amazing. As a real estate investor myself, let's talk a little bit about PRC Equity Fund. All right.
Right.
So, how do you explain the opportunity to investors like myself? And
Mhm.
how do you keep the message grounded and credible?
Yeah, so it's really simple. The nonprofit organization has access to virtually unlimited capital through the tax exempt municipal bond market as long as it's able to demonstrate that it's reducing the burden of government through its charitable programs, right? Okay. So now on the front end, now it doesn't get that capital right away. You just don't walk in and say, I need $100 million. You can go start the work. There has to be work done in advance of obtaining that money from the tax exempt bond market. If there's a development, the land has to be tied up or acquired. There's due diligence you have to do. There are market studies you have to do. There are soil studies. It has to be designed, engineered. All that has to be done prior to putting a bond package together to go to the bond market to close the transaction, right? So the question is, who pays for that? Okay. And so that's what PRC Equity Fund does. It provides that upfront capital. We call it pursuit capital. Some people refer to it as bridge capital to get the transaction to the point where we can close a bond transaction. Okay. And so now, because, the bond proceeds are generally, pretty large, there's enough money out of those proceeds to repay the equity fund at a X multiple. So, we have a project where we actually just got approved today, as a matter of fact,
Nice.
this morning, where
Congratulations.
we're acquiring for $89 million as an acquisition. And so the bond proceeds on this deal is more than 80. I won't give all the information, but it's more than what we're paying for it, right? But
Okay.
it's enough money to make sure that when we close that bond transaction, the $1.5 million, and think about this for a second, think in terms of leverage. Okay. The pursuit capital to close an $89 million transaction is only $1.5 million.
Mhm.
Isn't that crazy?
That's amazing.
And our money out of the fund is only in the deal for about 90 days.
Wow.
Okay.
Wow.
So we put up when we signed the contract, we put up a $500,000 earnest money check.
Okay.
So that money's not even being spent. Okay. And then after we do our due diligence, we put up another 500,000. So now we have $1 million of earnest money in the deal. Now, during that due diligence period, we're paying for our market study, our appraisal. We get a property inspection done. So we have those service providers. And so maybe that's another $150,000. Okay. So now the equity fund has deployed, let's just call it for easy numbers, $1.2 million. And a million of that really never got touched, right?
Right. It's
So, but
earnest
it
money.
deployed $1.2 million out of the fund into this transaction. Now the nonprofit goes and closes its bond.
Mm,
Okay. And now it has, enough money to pay for the property that it's acquiring. And then there's additional funds that's there. And part of that money is used to repay the equity fund at a 2x multiple.
mm,
Now just imagine doing that 4 times a year.
that's real good.
Yeah. And so, you know, that's how and one of the interesting things about our business model, in a lot of real estate deals, the money is made on the operations of the real estate asset, or is made based on creating value and then by operating it and then selling it at a greater value, right? It all involves operations. Our fund is different. Our fund, we generate income on the transaction. So the more transactions we do, the more money the fund makes.
Amazing.
So this year, for instance, we have $260 million of projects that's going to close in the first quarter of this year. We're in the process of closing $260 million in transactions. Our investment out of the fund is going to be roughly five, maybe $6 million to close $260 million in transactions.
That's unbelievable. That's
Okay.
not even what, 10%,
No, not even half of that. So,
5%.
our goal is to this year is to close $1 billion in transactions. Now, you may say, "Man, that's a lot of business." Well, remember that if the deal is $100 million, and most of these deals are about 100 million, some 150, $200 million, you're only looking at 7, 8, 9 transactions a year. You're not looking at a whole bunch of transactions a year. But some people have asked, well, how are you going to keep that pipeline full indefinitely? There are thousands of universities that need housing, and we're only doing 8 or 9 transactions a year. So I think we have a pretty broad pipeline.
Amazing. Are you only in the Texas area, or are you
No,
looking
we
at
have deals we're doing on Ohio, Wisconsin, Florida, Penn State, Utah. Um, yeah, we have deals. We looked at a deal in Hawaii, but they decided to go a different direction. But we have deals, and we're establishing partnerships with other groups that are doing similar things, but not with student housing. So our pipeline is, my biggest problem. I'll tell you this, and maybe this was the question you were going to ask. Well, Charles, what is your biggest problem? My biggest problem is talent. That limits our scalability.
Mm,
It is our talent pool, and now I'm not saying that there's not enough people that are willing to come and collect a paycheck. I'm talking about talent that's committed to doing the job and getting the job done, you know, because you got to understand that we as business owners, we have an entire um, a social dynamic that we're struggling with these days.
mm.
People literally think, I call them, the Kardashian rich, not work, just look good and not be accountable for anything. And now you're about to get me on a tangent, but but really that limits us is making sure we have the talent, the right talent that works for our company. They have to be aligned with our values. If we're going to have those values in our nonprofit and in our organization, then that person has to reflect our values as well. Okay.
Amazing.
And so that's our biggest challenge, is making sure we have the right talent on our team that can execute the things that we're involved in.
Incredible, Charles. What is some of the things that investors are actually wanting beyond returns?
When we do our presentation, I don't know if you've seen our entire presentation, but we spend probably about a third of the time talking about the social impact
Mhm.
and how this has impacted the lives of students going to these universities. In one of our video presentations that we show, it talks about this one student. She came from a single parent household, and, she was just barely making it. She's a senior, just about to graduate, had a little job. Her mom's struggling, she's struggling, but they're making it. You know, and then she has a car wreck.
Mm,
Now she no longer has transportation. She can't get to her job. And now it was a problem that would get resolved through insurance and things like that, but it was going to take a couple of months before that problem could be completely resolved. And what helped her bridge that gap was our rental assistance program.
wow.
We were
Amazing.
able to go in through our nonprofit because we don't make a profit in a nonprofit. We're able to redeploy that cash to provide assistance and a safety net for that student. And so when our investors hear that, when they understand that you can do good and but you can do well by doing good at the same time,
Mm,
that's a big motivator for them to invest with us. And that's the mission of our organization. Our company is going to make plenty of money. Our investors are going to make plenty of money. These are very large assets. They're extremely high demand for what we're doing. It all makes sense. Okay. And there are a lot of people out there doing it and probably making a lot more money than we're making, but we're making enough to, satisfy the returns that our investors need, but we're making more in that intangible return, you
beautiful.
know, by leaving an impact. And we have other programs that we're able to create as a result of what we're doing as we continue to scale and grow. And I think it's going to have a tremendous impact on the marketplace, especially in those tertiary markets where developers are not going to build student housing.
Very honorable. What do you do in order to communicate risk and structure in a way that builds trust to your investors?
Well, we really help them understand what we put in place in terms of the safety net, understanding what the market risks are as it relates to that asset class. Every asset has its own market risk. I don't care what you're investing in. It could be stocks, bonds. There's a risk factor there. So understanding the risk, okay, and then understanding what is the plan to mitigate the risk. And so no matter what you're investing in, first of all, understand that anything you invest in is going to have risk. And if they tell you that it does not have risk, then that's called a Ponzi scheme or called some kind of scam, because every deal, every investment opportunity, there's a risk profile associated with it. Now, the good money managers and the good people that are managing these funds, they're going to have a business plan that not only clearly defines the risk but also shows what they do to try to mitigate that risk. Now, you're always going to have deals that don't go well, and but if you have enough deals that do really well, it's going to offset those deals that don't do so well, and that's part of managing that risk as well.
Beautiful, Charles. Just talk a little bit about your nonprofit. We've talked a lot about your nonprofit, but you're not only building housing, you're also building a community, like you said, to impact layer through project PRC. So, why is
Mhm.
it important to pair the nonprofit mission with the real estate platform?
Yeah, well, because there's a genuine need in our community for housing. And, I'm not sure what part of the country you're in, but, it's amazing to me. We're in the Dallas Fort Worth area. And, there was a time you would never see a person sleeping under a bridge. Okay.
Hmm.
And here's my question to anyone who's listening to this. When you see that, do you feel some level of responsibility or obligation? Because let me tell you something. If as a society we don't address that issue, we're all going to be impacted. When's the last time you've been to San Francisco?
Probably like 30 years ago.
Okay, if you go to San Francisco, do you know that they are canceling conventions and events in the city of San Francisco because of its homelessness problem?
Wow.
What impact now? So now San Francisco is one of the most wealthy areas in the United States, but you have your super wealthy and then you have your super poor. Now, that doesn't seem risky. That doesn't seem like a security risk. So we're all connected. We're all brothers and sisters, and
Of course.
if we don't take care of each other, we're going to all feel the impact eventually. And so, just having a sense of consciousness about the fact that we all have an obligation to leave a positive impact on our communities, that's what fuels me. I have a pretty good living. I have some assets. I'm all right, you know, but how good am I really when my brother is laying under a bridge? Now there are a lot of things that creates that problem, but I'm gonna tell you something. If we don't address it as a community, we're gonna all suffer. I can promise you that.
Amen. You actually mentioned impact a couple of times. So, how do you measure impact in a way that's real, not just marketing?
It's really hard, and I think even with what we're doing, the scale of the problem is so great that it's going to take more than what we can do to really truly have an impact, right? But that doesn't mean we do nothing. You see what I'm saying? We're going to have some impacts on a few students that are able to graduate because they were able to create that housing continuity, eliminate that housing insecurity. Remember, we're only doing 8 or 9 projects a year. So, when you think in terms of our global scale,
Yeah,
it's going to be hard. Now, you'll notice that I clearly talk about our business plan, our business strategy. I go into great detail about it. And the reason why, because there needs to be more than me doing this. And the tools are out there to do it. There needs to be 20 companies like ours and 20 organizations or 1,000 organizations like ours that's doing what we do because it's a societal issue. We have a challenge, a social challenge that has to be fixed by our community. Well, I was thinking what's really interesting is, you know, the government have put the tools in place, to do this.
amazing.
Now it's tough because anytime the government makes rules and laws, they're going to be complicated, and you got to pay for extremely expensive attorneys to argue about, is that is that or is that, it's just, and I think that's why people get discouraged and say, it's not really worth it. There's got to be an easier way to make money than this, you know? Now, so I think that, so there are programs in place to really create that safety net, but they are so freaking complicated and nobody really has any clear direction that they can give you, that it makes it very difficult. And that's probably why a lot of folks don't get involved. We spend a lot of money on lawyers. My number one expense in business is payroll. My number two expense is legal, and it shouldn't be that way. And I think we can have more people would probably sign up to do what we're doing, more good people, because there are a lot of bad people that are doing it. They're the ones on Wall Street, you know. Yeah,
For real.
take a look at it, because their singular focus is money and driving their stock price.
Yep.
Okay,
Yep.
so and now these organizations can do exactly what we're doing and still make money, but they don't want to just make money. They want to dominate the industry and they want to make sure no one else makes anything, including the universities that they serve. And that's the problem with that.
Charles, you've been doing this for a long time. A platform doesn't scale on motivation, it scales on systems. So, what are the operational rhythms and disciplines that keep PRC running clean?
Yeah. So um, there is a human aspect um, to that. You have your processes and procedures, and so but it has to be managed by humans, and it often involves humans. So I know we don't necessarily think of humans as a part of a system or because a lot of times we think in terms of technology when it comes to systems, but you also have to understand that humans are not robots, right? And so they have to be properly encouraged and motivated and incentivized in order, and then they also have to be giving goals and directions. in order to perform the way that you want them to perform, right? So, you think about the McDonald's method. Isn't it interesting how you can take someone off the street, okay, who's never made a hamburger in their life, and
Right.
stick them into that McDonald's system, and that Big Mac comes out the same way every single time,
Doesn't matter where
right?
you are in the country or the world
Or the world,
or the world.
right?
Doesn't matter.
Okay. Yeah. So, how do you create that system so that you can get the predictable results? And so what we do, leadership training is very important. We have a leadership team, we have an executive committee. Our executive committee meets every Monday. And the primary, in addition to talking about business, the primary thing we spend about an hour, hour and a half on every Monday is on leadership
Mm,
and leadership skills and developing leaders in our organization. Okay. Because if you have a leader, guess what else you have?
followers.
You're going to have followers, right? Okay. So if I have a leader that's not performing, or in sync with our organization, and you got 5 people following that person, what's going to happen to your system?
It's gonna crash.
It's going to break, right? And so that's what we try to do, is to make sure that we keep our processes and procedures consistent, but we also develop leaders within the organization that can help develop other leaders. And that's the biggest thing. Technology is always going to change. One of the axioms that's prevalent in our company, we have 14 principles that we talk about every Monday in our staff meeting. We have a staff meeting at 2 o'clock every Monday. Mondays is usually a day just full of meetings, but this particular meeting, with all of our staff, we have staff in the Philippines. That's our back office. We have staff throughout the country, Philadelphia, Tennessee. Our headquarters is in the Dallas Fort Worth area, but everyone is generally on this call. And we go over our 14 principles, and one of those 14 principles comes from a person who I admired and read a lot of his books, a guy by the name of Stephen Covey.
Oh, I see, Covey.
And Stephen Covey wrote, business psychologist, uh,
Sure.
you know, good in terms of helping develop leaders. But one of his principles was, to sharpen your saw. 7 habits of highly successful people. One of those principles is sharpening your saw. And so, we are a steward of the talent that God has given us. And it is our personal responsibility to develop that talent. And what we tell our employees when we talk about this subject, and we talk about it every Monday, if you take an hour a day, okay, to learn a skill, okay, by the end of the year, you spent 365 hours learning that skill. And you would have become an expert in whatever you were learning to do, even if it's just arranging flowers, right?
Right, right.
Okay. Now, if you start at the age of 18
Mm,
and you develop a new skill every year, it
you'll be
is impossible for you to be poor and broke and homeless.
you become a master.
Okay. You become a master. So, you asked me about my career, and we talked about being progressive.
Mhm.
That's something I've always done. I was never a big television watcher, but I was always interested in learning something new,
Nice.
learning accounting, learning finance, learning how to edit videos, because I'm interested in learning, you know, and I feel that I have a personal responsibility to be a faithful steward of the talent, the natural talent that God has given me.
Amazing. What are your non-negotiable KPIs or dashboard that you review consistently?
Yeah, so our goal is we have to have a positive impact economically and socially, everything that we do. So we measure, the social impact that we're having, and we have systems in place through our nonprofit organization to do that. But then we also have a responsibility to make sure we're providing a sustainable return to our investors. One of the things that we commit to our investors, and many of these are retirees. And so having that mailbox money is extremely important to them.
Mm,
We make sure that, we're involved in projects that's going to make sure that that dividend fund stays full and we keep money in it so that we can consistently pay that dividend. So, we have a lot of measures and systems in place. Some of it is a bit proprietary in terms of how we do our business, but we're always evaluating what we're doing, how we're doing it, and the impact it's having on our business in general.
that's beautiful, Charles. Let's talk a little bit about AI. This is the AI Edge podcast, and we treat
Mm.
AI as leverage, not magic. So, in a business like yours, where do you see AI and automation actually improving execution in a meaningful way?
Yeah, I think right now there are a lot of tools that are coming out, and I don't know them all and don't understand them all, but I do use AI probably daily. It could be chat GPT, or looking at ways to how our videos are edited. What's really interesting in terms of our marketing, we've you probably have seen other corporations generate these television commercials, and it says this commercial was done by AI. Well, we've started exploring that as well. In
Nice.
fact, we have an entire campaign that we're rolling out that's all AI driven. For me personally, just reading and summarizing documents,
Mm,
it has been extremely helpful. My day is generally spent with something involving legal, contractual, uh, and so the ability to quickly go and research something that's already in our system or already in our file, but it happened 3 years ago, and so we don't remember all the details, but we can go pull that information, get a summary, or to look at a contract, or the structure. Now, the one thing I will warn you, and I tell my team, and I don't know if this is helpful or not. Please don't let AI think for you. It does not think for you. Don't ask it questions that, where it's thinking for you, because it's going to give you a wrong answer. What AI does, at least chat does, it organizes information for you. Okay, yeah, but you're the person that's got to do the thinking. You know what I mean? It can go and pull out information and put it in such a way to where now you can use your brain to determine what the next step is. But your question has to do with AI. It's interesting on our properties in terms of the actual physical property. Our properties are becoming smart properties. We're able to, using AI technology, to integrate all of these systems and then have those systems evaluate things in terms of security and safety, and even as far as who's damaging our apartment units. So, and those systems are continuing to become more prevalent. But what I really love about is the fact these used to be, systems that were not integrated. Now we're able to integrate
hmm
these things. And of course, being a technology guy, coming from the controls system era, that's extremely exciting to me. And what we're able to do in terms of on the properties we control, what we're able to do using AI when it comes to keeping that student safe.
Mm,
It's interesting that on one of our properties, a parent was touring our facility, and there was a police officer who was there for some reason or another. And so she asked this police officer his opinion about, if it was your child, what would you have them say? And that police officer said that our property was the safest property in that community.
wow, that's excellent.
Yeah, and a lot of that has to do with some of the technology that we've integrated into our property. And so every property that's going to be owned by Project PRC is going to have, that security, that high level of automation. One, it reduces our costs, but more importantly, it keeps our students safe.
That's beautiful. If you could wave a magic wand and remove one reoccurring bottleneck using systems like AI, what would it be?
You're gonna get me in trouble because I want to say attorneys, but that
Yeah,
might
yeah.
not
You
be the
said
right.
legal. Legal is like most of your time, right?
Yeah, yeah, it's a lot of my time. Legal is, and you know the thing about the legal, nobody really knows the answer to anything. You know, it's all well. The IRS might say this, or they might rule this way. Oh, that well, does somebody have an answer?
That makes
So,
it difficult.
um, I would, you know, if if it's government, because they put these things in place to where you have can have the nonprofit, the tax exempt bond market. If they would create some policies that simplified all that, number one, you're gonna have more people doing it, and then the problem's going to get fixed because there are more people doing it. The reason why there are not most people don't even realize that nonprofits are treated differently based on how they fill out the application to become a nonprofit.
Really?
Yeah. And in order to know how to structure your nonprofit properly, you got to go to a $1,400 an hour attorney who does this all day long. But when you go to them, they're going to act like it's the first time they've ever seen it. And so they're probably going to charge you about a month's worth of time to do something they do every day, right? These are the things that make it that creates a high bar for folks to get into this industry and to do. You got to understand, we started our nonprofit back in 2022. Yeah, yeah. And we've invested hundreds of thousands of dollars into it before we could get it to the point where we could actually transact business. Yeah, you know,
That's a large barrier of entry.
it's a significant barrier of entry.
When you zoom out on what you're building towards, what does success look like 10 years from now for you and PRC and for the communities that you serve?
Yeah, it's the impact. The impact on students when we get those testimonials that come back and say that I graduated and I was able to go on and launch my career and have a meaningful impact on society because I was able to get a college education and get the training I needed. And this is how it's really impacted my family. So that's the true impact. And then on our investors, when that retiree, 10 years from now can sit back and say, for 10 years, I've consistently gotten a check for an investment I made with the PRC equity fund. And it's allowed me to, to supplement my retirement, to sustain me financially, to give me a measure of comfort as I live out the last years of my life. Those are the things that to me are impactful. We're here to serve. Believe it or not, most people don't realize this, but we're all here to serve. Okay. And now, are you a good steward of what you've been given? A good and faithful slave, or are you squandering the assets that you have? And if you're only focused on yourself, then you're squandering it, and you're not going to find true happiness. Happiness is not built on wealth and how much money is in your bank. It's built on the impact you have in helping other people live. Now, that's my opinion.
That's beautiful. Charles, this has been a great conversation. You brought some grounded operator first views for student housing and impact, and you made it practical. For listeners who want to follow your work, learn more about PRC, Equity Fund, Project PRC, where's the best place to find you online?
Yeah, so Project PRC, and there are opportunities for you to volunteer, get involved. We're coming up with some committees where you can volunteer and go serve at one of our communities and participate in, helping people get a financial education or just general practical help. And we could go on forever. One of the things people don't realize, and this is one of the most impactful things that we do with regards to our organization. But in the state of Texas, if you're in the foster care program, the state of Texas pays for your education. Okay. And they will also pay for your housing, but they only pay for housing when school is in session. So when school is out of session, then that foster child does not have a place to live. And so that's again another area where our communities have an impact. We're able to fill that gap. So that's projectprc.org. You can go there. Also, if you're interested in investing in the uh, fund and you think this is a good fit for you and it aligns with your financial goals and your principles, then go to prcequityfund. And there, you can learn more about our company, learn a lot about our leadership. You can see testimonials of people who are already invested in our fund. And then you can make the decision if this is right for you or not.
Beautiful. Charles, thank you again. We'll drop those links and tags in the show notes. Thank you again for coming on and sharing what you're doing and what you're approaching student housing with discipline, purpose, and real systems mindset. This has been the AI Edge podcast. If you got value from this episode, share with another operator investor who cares about real estate that performs and makes a difference. We'll see you on the next episode. Thank you so much, Charles.